The auditorium buzzed with energy, a symphony of camera flashes, murmured conversations, and the calculated charm of the world's wealthiest and most powerful individuals. This was no ordinary business gathering, it was the Global Tech and Business Summit, a spectacle where influence wasn't just displayed but reinforced. The front row was lined with industry titans, billionaires, and CEOs who had built empires from the ground up, their presence alone enough to command attention. Every handshake was strategic, every smirk a carefully crafted message. At the heart of it all sat Victor Langston, the self-proclaimed king of innovation, a man whose name was synonymous with disruption, ambition, and unchecked confidence. With a net worth that rivaled small nations, Langston wasn't just a businessman, he was a brand, a force, a master of the public spectacle. Every move he made was calculated, every word designed to keep the spotlight firmly on him. But tonight, something was different. A last-minute addition to the panel had shaken up the evening's expected script: Keanu Reeves. Unlike the billionaires surrounding him, Keanu wasn't here to discuss market trends, stock acquisitions, or the latest AI revolution. His purpose was simple yet profound: to talk about ethics in technological advancement. A stark contrast to the room full of men who had built their legacies on profit and power. As Keanu stepped onto the stage in his signature understated black suit, the atmosphere shifted. Whispers rippled through the audience. He was not a businessman. He was not a billionaire. So why was he here? Victor Langston smirked, already sensing an opportunity to put this outsider in his place. He leaned forward, microphone in hand, and let his voice carry across the vast auditorium. Keanu Reeves, he drawled, amusement dripping from every syllable. What exactly are you doing here? Last I checked, this was a business summit, not a Comic-Con panel. Laughter rippled through the room, some hesitant, others eager to align themselves with the powerful billionaire. The cameras zoomed in, ready to capture the unfolding drama. But Keanu? He didn't flinch. Not even for a second. Victor Langston leaned back in his chair, his smirk widening as the room filled with laughter, some hesitant, some eager to align themselves with the billionaire's bravado. He had played this game 100 times before. Challenge, belittle, assert dominance. And usually, it worked. His wealth, his influence, his ability to command a room had always been enough. But Keanu Reeves was unlike any opponent Langston had faced before. Seated with effortless composure, Keanu didn't flinch, didn't rush to respond. Instead, he simply folded his hands, letting the laughter die down naturally, unbothered by the spectacle unfolding around him. The weight of silence stretched uncomfortably, shifting the energy in the room. What had started as a moment of amusement was now turning into something else, something heavier. Langston, sensing his momentum slipping, pressed forward. Really though, he continued, his voice oozing condescension. We're here to talk about innovation, about building things. Generational wealth. Empires. He turned slightly toward the audience, as if letting them in on some grand inside joke. And yet, we have someone who, what? Fights imaginary villains in front of a green screen. The laughter this time was less enthusiastic. A few chuckles, scattered and unsure. Langston wasn't finished. His voice took on a sharper edge, the kind of confidence that came from being a man who had never been told no. Look, don't get me wrong, I love John Wick. Great action, very entertaining, he said, waving a dismissive hand. But let's be honest. What could you possibly teach us about success? The air in the room shifted. The laughter stopped. Keanu tilted his head slightly, as if genuinely considering the question. Then, with a quiet exhale, he finally spoke. Success, he repeated, his voice smooth, unshaken. Tell me something, Victor, when you walk down the street, when you step into a coffee shop, when you're surrounded by people who don't work for you, do they smile at you? Do they shake your hand? Do they tell you that you've impacted their lives? Langston's smirk twitched, barely, but enough for those paying attention to notice. Because that happens to me, Keanu continued, leaning forward slightly, his voice still calm. Every day. And not because I have money. Not because I have power. But because of the way I treat people. The silence that followed was absolute. You measure success by how much money you make, Keanu said, his voice quiet but commanding. I measure it by how much I've given away. You talk about generational wealth, I talk about generational kindness. The billionaire's face stiffened. So tell me, Victor, Keanu's eyes locked onto Langston's, unwavering. When you're gone, what will people remember? The number in your bank account? Or the way you made them feel? A ripple of realization passed through the audience. The power had shifted. The game had changed. And for the first time in his life, Victor Langston had no comeback. For the first time that evening, the room was silent. Not the kind of silence that comes from disinterest, but the thick, weighted silence of realization. Victor Langston, the billionaire who had spent his life commanding rooms, dictating narratives, and bending conversations to his will, sat frozen. His smirk was gone. His usual air of untouchable confidence was slipping. Keanu Reeves had just done something no one had ever dared to do in public. He had challenged the very foundation of Langston's existence. The cameras caught it all. The flicker of discomfort in Langston's eyes. The subtle tightening of his jaw. The way his fingers curled slightly against the table, as if searching for something solid to grip. The audience could feel it, the shift. Langston swallowed, then forced a chuckle. It was tight, unnatural, the kind of forced laughter that a man makes when he knows he's lost but refuses to acknowledge it. That's cute, he said, waving a dismissive hand. But let's be real here, Keanu. Kindness doesn't build billion-dollar empires. It doesn't make the world turn. Money does. Keanu tilted his head slightly, as if considering the statement. Then, he gave the smallest nod. Money can do a lot, he admitted, his voice calm, steady. It can buy influence. It can buy opportunity. It can even buy the illusion of respect. He let the words hang in the air for a moment, letting them sink in before delivering the final blow. But it can't buy real connection. It can't buy peace of mind. And it sure as hell can't buy character. A murmur rolled through the crowd, not laughter this time, but something more meaningful. The sound of people agreeing. Langston's smile twitched, his patience thinning. He wasn't used to this. Wasn't used to being outmatched, especially not by an actor. He leaned in, his voice dropping, attempting to regain control. You know, Keanu, he said, gesturing vaguely with his hand, I think I get it now. You've built this whole nice guy persona, the humble, down-to-earth Hollywood outsider. And hey, it works. People love that crap. He smirked, trying to reclaim the audience. They love the idea of someone rich who still acts like them, who rides the subway, gives away money, smiles for selfies. But let's not pretend you're actually different. He paused for effect. You've made millions off your name. Just like the rest of us. A flicker of something unreadable passed through Keanu's eyes. But still, he didn't react the way Langston wanted him to. He didn't get angry. He didn't get defensive. He just let the words hang in the air. Then, after a long pause, he simply said, I don't pretend it doesn't matter. I just don't let it define me. Another beat of silence. And if I lost it all tomorrow, Keanu continued, I'd still be me. Langston blinked. For a split second, his mouth opened as if to respond, but nothing came out. Because how do you argue with that? How do you defeat a man who has already made peace with everything you fear the most? The audience could feel the power dynamic shattering. This wasn't just an exchange between two men anymore, this was a reckoning. The moment where everyone in the room, everyone watching live, saw the truth. Victor Langston wasn't powerful. He was just rich. And for the first time in his life, that wasn't enough. The silence stretched. Someone in the back of the room coughed. The weight of the moment was suffocating. Then, from the crowd, a voice rang out. Clear. Loud. Unmistakable. If you're so powerful, why do you look so scared? The laughter that followed was different this time. It wasn't with Langston. It was at him. His face darkened, his fingers drumming nervously against the table. His entire career had been built on being the man who controlled the room. But right now, the room was slipping from his grasp like sand through his fingers. Keanu? Keanu just sat there, completely at ease, watching it unfold. Because he didn't need to win. He had already proven everything he needed to. Victor Langston had spent his entire life believing in one simple truth: money is power. And for decades, that belief had served him well. Until tonight. Tonight, in front of millions watching live, in a room filled with the wealthiest, most influential people in the world, he was losing something money couldn't buy. Respect. The moment had slipped away from him, faster than he could grasp it. Keanu Reeves, an actor, not a businessman, had dismantled him without ever raising his voice, without ever needing to flex his wealth or status. And now, the room wasn't his anymore. The same audience that had laughed at his jokes just minutes ago was watching him differently, not with admiration, not even with fear, but with something worse. Pity. Langston clenched his jaw, trying to regain control. Trying to salvage the moment. He let out a sharp, forced laugh, shaking his head as if the entire exchange had been nothing more than an amusing little detour. "All right," he said, waving a dismissive hand, his voice carrying the kind of bravado that only desperation could produce. "You got your moment, Keanu. Congratulations." But the audience didn't laugh this time. Undeterred, he turned his attention back to them, shifting into damage control mode. "Let's be honest, folks," he continued, leaning forward. "This is all optics, right? A great Hollywood moment. The underdog standing up to the big, bad billionaire." He smirked, eyes flicking toward the cameras, trying to reframe the narrative. "But when this is over..." His voice dropped, turning smug again. "I'll still be running multi-billion-dollar companies. I'll still be shaping industries. I'll still be making the real impact." He leaned in, just slightly, his voice carrying the weight of a challenge. "And you?" He turned back to Keanu, his smirk returning. "You'll still just be a guy playing make-believe." The words should have cut deep. They should have turned the room back in his favor. But Keanu didn't even blink. Instead, he exhaled softly, then spoke with the same effortless calm that had already shaken Langston's world to its core. "You know, Victor," Keanu said, "I once heard someone say," he paused for just a beat, letting the tension build. "If you're the richest man in the room, but no one respects you, you're actually the poorest." A sharp intake of breath rippled through the crowd. Langston's smirk faltered. Keanu continued. "I've played a lot of roles in my life," he said, his voice steady. "Heroes, villains, warriors, kings. But the greatest role, the one I don't have to act for, is being a decent human being." Another pause. Another shift in energy. "And the funny thing about that?" Keanu tilted his head slightly, his eyes locked onto Langston's. "It's completely free." The audience erupted. It wasn't just applause, it was something deeper. It was an acknowledgement. A recognition. Langston sat there, his face blank, his hands tightening around the microphone. He had lost the room. The crowd wasn't entertained anymore. They weren't impressed by his money, his power, his arrogance. They were watching him unravel. And then, the final blow. One of Langston's fellow panelists, a respected tech mogul who had remained silent for most of the exchange, reached for his microphone. He adjusted his tie, cleared his throat, then spoke. "I have to say, Victor," he began, his voice calm but pointed. "I've been in business for decades. I've built companies, taken risks, closed deals that have changed industries." He glanced at Keanu, then back at Langston. "But I've never seen a man destroy his own credibility this thoroughly in a single night." The crowd erupted again. Some gasped. Others clapped. A few even laughed outright. Langston's face went pale. His mouth opened slightly, searching for a response, for something, anything, to flip this back in his favor. But there was nothing left to say. And then, the moment that sealed his fate. One of the event's top sponsors, a major investor who had been associated with Langston for years, stood up. Without a word, he adjusted his suit jacket, and walked out. Then another. Then another. Langston saw it happening in real time. He wasn't just losing face. He wasn't just being embarrassed. He was being abandoned. His empire, the very thing he had spent his life building, was slipping through his fingers. Keanu. Keanu just sat there, watching. Calm. Collected. Unbothered. Because he had nothing to prove. He never had. Langston, on the other hand, had just lost everything. The audience murmured. The producers in the control room were already cutting clips, preparing headlines. And then, from the back of the room, a single voice. Loud. Clear. Unmistakable. "If you're so powerful, why do you look so scared?" The laughter that followed was different this time. It wasn't with Langston. It was at him. Langston's hands curled into fists beneath the table. His billionaire composure, so carefully constructed, was crumbling under the weight of something he had never truly faced before. Consequences. And just when he thought it couldn't get worse. One by one, his biggest investors began walking out. Langston's stomach twisted. His jaw clenched. His fingers dug into the table. This wasn't just about humiliation anymore. This was about something far worse. Reputation. The one thing money couldn't buy. The cameras were still rolling. The internet was already ablaze. Langston had spent his career building an empire on power, dominance, and intimidation. But tonight? Tonight, he had been undone by something stronger. Character. And as he sat there, surrounded by the fallout of his own arrogance, one horrifying truth settled into his mind. For the first time in his life, he had nothing left to bargain with. Victor Langston stormed through the backstage corridors, his mind racing, his breath uneven. The roaring applause behind him was not for him, it was for Keanu Reeves. The billionaire's hands clenched into fists as he pushed past event staff, ignoring the murmurs, the sideways glances. He knew exactly what they were thinking, exactly what was being whispered behind his back. Did you see how he froze? Keanu wrecked him. This is everywhere already. His phone wouldn't stop buzzing. Each vibration was a fresh reminder that his fall was playing out in real time. Social media was already ablaze, news outlets scrambling to be the first to release the headline that would define his downfall. Victor Langston, the billionaire who just got humbled on live TV. A staffer approached him hesitantly. "Mr. Langston, your car is waiting." Not his car. Not his usual fleet of black SUVs, the carefully orchestrated convoy that announced his presence before he even stepped into a building. Just a car. A generic courtesy vehicle, the same one they provided to every speaker, every guest. His stomach twisted. They had already started pulling away from him. The beginning of the end. As the car pulled away from the venue, he finally checked his phone. Board group chat, urgent. "CFO, we need to talk. Tonight." "VP of Communications, damage control is impossible. This is spreading too fast." Investor relations, major partners are pulling out. Stocks are already dipping. Langston's grip on his phone tightened. This wasn't just bad press. This was the kind of scandal that could destroy an empire. He pulled up the financial feeds. Stock futures were in freefall. Investors weren't just concerned. They were running. Langston exhaled sharply, trying to steady himself. This was salvageable. It had to be. Then, another headline flashed across his screen. Major sponsors cut ties with Langston following Global Tech Summit disaster. Langston felt his pulse spike. It had begun. One by one, companies were distancing themselves. This wasn't business as usual. This was a cleansing. And he was the stain being scrubbed out. Meanwhile, Keanu Reeves. While Langston's empire burned, Keanu Reeves sat quietly in the back of a black SUV, gazing out at the passing city lights. His phone vibrated. A text from an old friend. "You just made history tonight." Keanu sighed, shaking his head slightly. He hadn't set out to make history. He hadn't set out to take down a billionaire. He had simply spoken the truth. His driver glanced at him in the rearview mirror. "Hell of a night, huh?" Keanu smirked, leaning his head back against the seat. "Yeah," he said. "Hell of a night." The final blow. By the time Langston reached his penthouse, the damage was irreversible. His inbox was flooded. His board of directors had already scheduled an emergency meeting. He barely had time to pour himself a drink before his phone buzzed again. "Investor relations, we need you to prepare for some hard decisions." Langston swallowed hard. He knew what that meant. They weren't asking for damage control anymore. They were asking for his resignation. The board wasn't waiting to talk this over. They were already moving to contain him. His mind raced, scrambling for a plan, any way to claw back control. But deep down, he knew. There was no controlling this. The headlines had already cemented his fate. Victor Langston removed as CEO following public backlash. Keanu Reeves's words that ended a billionaire's influence overnight. The fall of a titan, Victor Langston's legacy in question. Legacy. That was what stung the most. Not the money. Not even the power. But the realization that his name, the thing he had spent his entire life making untouchable, was now tainted beyond repair. He had spent decades building an empire. And now, in less than 24 hours, he had lost everything. Keanu Reeves, a different kind of power. While Langston was being erased from his own company, Keanu Reeves was walking through the streets of Los Angeles, completely unaware of the deeper ripple effects of what had happened. He wasn't attending victory parties. He wasn't giving interviews. He wasn't celebrating. Because, to him, this was never about winning. It had been about speaking the truth. That morning, a journalist had reached out, asking for a statement about Langston's downfall. Keanu had politely declined. Instead, he walked into a small bookstore, one of the few independent shops still surviving in the age of digital everything. The owner, an elderly woman named Martha, smiled as he entered. "Well, if it isn't my favorite customer," she said. "You caused quite a stir last night, young man." Keanu chuckled. "So I've heard." She placed a newspaper in front of him. "The Keanu Effect, Why the World is Rethinking Success." "You didn't just expose Langston," she said. "You reminded people that kindness still matters." Keanu exhaled, running a hand through his hair. "That was never my goal." "And that," she said with a knowing smile, "is exactly why it worked." He bought a book, nothing fancy, just something that caught his eye, before heading back outside, disappearing into the city like he always did. Because while the world debated what had happened, while Langston's empire crumbled, Keanu Reeves was simply living the final moments of Victor Langston. That night, Victor Langston sat alone in his penthouse for the last time. By morning, it would belong to someone else. His board had wasted no time ensuring his departure was absolute. His assets were liquidated. His investments seized. His access to the company's resources revoked. And as he sat there, staring at the empty glass in his hand, he finally understood something. Money had never made him powerful. It had given him the illusion of power. But real power, the kind Keanu had, was something money could never buy. Because real power was respect. Real power was integrity. And Langston had spent his entire life chasing something that had never truly mattered. And now, it was too late. The world moves on. Keanu Reeves had walked away from the summit with his integrity intact. Victor Langston had walked away with nothing. And the world? The world had already moved on. Victor Langston sat alone in his penthouse, staring at the city skyline that once felt like it belonged to him. The glittering lights, the towering skyscrapers, symbols of his empire, now felt distant, like remnants of a kingdom that had crumbled overnight. His name had once commanded respect and fear in equal measure. Now, it was nothing more than a cautionary tale. The news cycle had already begun to shift. The headlines weren't just about his downfall anymore. They were about what came next. Langston resigns, a new era for corporate leadership. What the Keanu Reeves moment taught the world about power and respect. Is this the end of billionaire arrogance? It wasn't just about him anymore. His failure had become symbolic. For decades, the world had been ruled by men like him, men who believed that money was the answer to every question, the solution to every problem, the ultimate form of power. But tonight had shattered that illusion in front of millions. And now, people were asking questions. The board makes its final move. The morning after the summit, Langston sat in the executive boardroom of the company he had built from the ground up. The long glass conference table, once designed to make others feel small in his presence, now felt like a trap, closing in around him. Across from him sat his board of directors, men and women who had once hung on to his every word, who had benefited from his ambition, who had never questioned his decisions before. Today, their expressions were cold. Calculated. Final. Victor, the chairman began, his voice steady, professional. We appreciate everything you've done to build this company. But in light of recent events, we believe it's in everyone's best interest if you step away. Langston forced himself to sit up straighter, masking the nausea building in his gut. I already agreed to resign as CEO, he said, his voice clipped. That was the deal. The chairman nodded but didn't soften. That was the first step, he said. But investors are nervous. Stockholders are demanding a complete separation. His voice was matter-of-fact, unemotional. That means selling your remaining shares. Divesting from all leadership positions. Langston stared at him, stunned. You want me to walk away from my own company? The CFO, a man who had once been nothing but loyal, leaned forward. Victor, he said quietly, you are the problem now. The longer your name is attached to this company, the more damage we take. The words landed like a punch to the gut. For the first time in his life, Victor Langston had no leverage. No bargaining power. No escape route. His money couldn't fix this. He had spent his career believing that wealth was the ultimate weapon, the great equalizer that could buy influence, loyalty, control. But money without respect is fragile. He exhaled slowly, his eyes flickering to the legal documents in front of him. He could fight this. Drag it out in court for years. But it wouldn't matter. His name was poison now. Finally, with a hand that trembled just slightly, he picked up the pen. And signed. And just like that, Victor Langston was no longer a billionaire. Keanu Reeves, a different kind of power. While Langston's empire collapsed, Keanu Reeves was walking through the streets of Los Angeles, completely unaware of the deeper ripple effects of what had happened at the summit. He wasn't attending victory parties. He wasn't giving interviews. He wasn't celebrating. Because, to him, this was never about winning. It had been about speaking the truth. As he stepped into a small cafe, a young woman hesitated near his table. "Excuse me, Mr. Reeves," she said, her voice uncertain. Keanu glanced up and smiled. "Yeah." She fidgeted with her phone before finally speaking. I just wanted to say thank you. For what you said last night." Keanu tilted his head. "Oh." She nodded, her voice gaining confidence. "It reminded me that success isn't about money. It's about who you are when no one's watching." She smiled. "And I think a lot of people needed to hear that." "I know I did." Keanu set his coffee down, truly looking at her, not as a fan, not as a stranger, but as a person. "Then that makes it worth it," he said simply. She smiled, nodded, and walked away. And just like that, Keanu knew. He hadn't just won a debate. He had started a conversation. A movement. The final moments of Victor Langston. That night, Victor Langston sat alone in his penthouse for the last time. By morning, it would belong to someone else. His board had wasted no time ensuring his departure was complete. His assets were liquidated. His investments seized. His access to the company's resources permanently revoked. And as he sat there, staring at the empty glass in his hand, he finally understood something. Money had never made him powerful. It had given him the illusion of power. But real power, the kind Keanu had, was something money could never buy. Because real power was respect. Real power was integrity. And Victor Langston had spent his entire life chasing something that had never truly mattered. And now, it was too late.